So the new Superlight 2 just came out and it is 2000 Hertz. That's it. I mean, there are some other small differences here and there, like the switch feel, for example, but that is the big feature upgrade here. Twice the polling rate of the old one. So, is it worth it? I mean, can you notice that difference? Is it a noticeably smoother input, or is it just going to drain your battery twice as fast? Well, lately, a lot of gaming mouse companies have been jumping on this train for higher polling rates. Most of them actually selling separate dongles as an upgrade that can run it up to 4000 Hertz. Honestly though, I'm seeing a lot of people more confused than ever on whether this stuff is worth it. Almost like this pressure of your next mouse has to be 2000 Hertz plus, otherwise you're going to be left behind. For example, if you're in the market for a nice, ergonomic mouse, do you go with one of the new Zowie ECs, which have like a really nice coating and a really nice click feel, or do you go with the Death Adder V3 from Razer, which is not as nice in that regard if I'm being completely honest, but this one can clock at over 4 times faster, 4000 Hertz. So you've got a bit of a dilemma here. Do you choose the faster mouse or the one that feels kind of nicer in the hand? Higher polling rates are exactly what they sound like. Your mouse can now send updates to your PC at a faster rate. Most mice are 1000 Hertz, and if you're playing on a 240 Hertz monitor, that's basically 4 cursor updates every screen refresh. But with a 2000 Hertz mouse, you're now getting twice that. So now when the frame is rendered, you actually get a more recent and accurate cursor position shown on your screen. And at 4000 Hertz, 8000 Hertz, it gets even better. The time delay between your cursor position and where it's being rendered on your screen is reduced even more. And it's also the inconsistency in that delay, which is reduced as well. Something that a lot of people don't realize about these high polling rates though, is that your mouse is only going to be running at them if it really needs to. It's not like if you have a 4000 Hertz mouse that it's constantly sending 4000 updates a second to your PC when it's just sitting there. So think of polling rates more like a cap. It's like the maximum amount of updates that the mouse can send to the PC per second. And at 2000 Hertz, 4000 Hertz, you really do need a lot of input to require that amount of updates. So one way to actually get around this is to just set a higher mouse DPI. That way, even with smaller mouse movement, you can still achieve those high polling rates. DPI stands for dots per inch, also known as CPI, which is counts per inch. Basically, it's the amount of times that the sensor can update its position within an inch of movement. This is why your sensitivity doubles when you go from 400 to 800 DPI. It's because your mouse is actually taking in twice the input. Of course, to counter this, whenever you double your DPI, you just halve your in-game sensitivity. So I did some playing around at 4000 Hertz polling rate, just moving my mouse around at different speeds to see how fast I need to move it to actually achieve a 4000 Hertz polling rate. And at 400 DPI, despite setting a 4000 Hertz polling rate, you'll actually be running most of the time around 1000 Hertz. 400 DPI just isn't enough input for the sensor to require 4000 updates per second, unless you're like really swiping the mouse back and forth super quickly. Jumping up to 800 DPI though, now we see 4000 Hertz polling. It's achieved a lot more often, especially when moving the mouse at more typical tracking speeds, but it's still not quite there 100%. 1600 DPI is really where most people should be playing at in my opinion. Here we're getting pretty much peak polling rate saturation where the mouse is always running at 4000 Hertz, whether we're moving it slow or fast or doing a big swipe or micro tracking. Those latency benefits of getting the most updated cursor position will always be applied no matter how we're moving the mouse. But can you actually see and feel this higher polling rate difference? Well, to answer that question, I built this test setup here. We have a super slow motion camera aimed at a 540 Hertz monitor, and this little machine which can move a mouse across a fixed distance. One of the biggest things that people are claiming about higher polling rates is that it gives you a smoother input, and that's what I really wanted to find out. So let's start all the way at the bottom. If we tank the mouse all the way down to a polling rate of 125 Hertz, for experimental purposes of course, we get a stuttery input as we would expect. Bumping up to 250 Hertz polling, it's now dramatically smoother, and at 500 Hertz polling, we're pretty much at the monitor's refresh rate, but we do see some inconsistent movement. That resolves at 1000 Hertz polling though, since we're now getting more than one cursor update per screen refresh. And I've got to say, despite everything I just said about higher polling rates being better, it is hard to see any difference here beyond 1000 Hertz. We're running the new Superlight 2 here at 3200 DPI, so 2000 Hertz polling rate is definitely achieved. I've watched these clips back several times and there's just no real difference. Maybe there's a bit more horizontal jumping at 1000 Hz versus 2000, but it really is a stretch, and it's definitely not something that you're going to notice when you're actually playing. I then tested the new Pulsar X2, which can run it up to 4000 Hz, and even here, there's just no obvious difference in smoothness that you can see. And remember, this is on a 540 Hz monitor. If you're playing at 240 Hz, which is what this looks like, the inputs are absolutely identical. So all of this talk about higher polling rates giving you a noticeably smoother input, I mean, I think it is mostly placebo. The only thing that I personally noticed in those comparisons was the screen tearing at 540 Hz. That to me is pretty obvious when things are slowed down, but even in real-time gameplay, those screen tears just disappear. You can't notice them at all. And I think that really puts into perspective how unperceivable these higher polling rates are going to be when you're actually playing. If I can't even see them when things are slowed down this dramatically, then how am I possibly going to notice them during actual gameplay? Now, to simplify this test as much as I possibly can, let's look at a plain cursor moving on a black background. Again though, maybe 1000 Hz has a bit more inconsistent pacing, 4000 Hz maybe looks a bit smoother in real time, but man, it is really a stretch. And then finally, if we do much faster cursor movement and then we freeze frame each individual refresh, only then can we see the smoothness difference between 4000 and 1000 Hz on this 540 Hz display. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that higher polling rates are bad or anything like that. I mean, I've just spent the first half of this video explaining the complete opposite, and those facts still remain. I mean, if you have the option there on the mouse that you're using to just click an option and get a tiny bit faster input, I say, why not? I mean, I'm personally playing at 2000 Hz for that very reason. The option is there, so why not just click it and just forget about it? And also the battery drain isn't as bad as 4000 Hz polling, which I also have there as an option. Now, something really interesting is that on my mouse, when it dips below 30% battery, it switches automatically from 2000 Hz to 1000 Hz to save power. And I cannot tell when it does that. It's not like I'm playing at 2000 Hz and everything's smooth, and then it switches over to 1000 and everything's stuttery. It is not like that at all. I literally can't tell when it dips below 30% battery. I actually need to check at the end of a gaming session to see what the battery and the polling rate is sitting at. So look, high polling rates are pretty cool, but I would recommend 2000 Hz as a sensible cap. You know, if you're playing on a 360 Hz or a 540 Hz monitor and you have the option there to tick 2000 Hz, I do think that is a sensible thing to do if you don't mind that taking your battery about 1.5 times to 2 times as much. You know, personally, I try and do most of my latency and monitor testing in actual games to show you what the actual user experience benefit is going to be. And when it comes to high polling rates, there's just really not much to show. I think more than anything, don't feel like you're missing out just because these gaming mice are getting faster and faster. 4000 Hz, you know, I know it's really enticing, but if you have a 1000 Hz mouse that you play really well with, I'd recommend just sticking with that, even if you're playing on a 360 Hz plus monitor. I also think you should not choose your next gaming mouse upgrade exclusively because of high polling rates. I mean, it's really cool to see the technology getting faster and we're approaching that 0 millisecond input, which is just insane. But, I mean, it doesn't really make for a different experience.